At this time, I'd like to welcome in a man who has been involved in pro wrestling for a very long time. He was the 1967 NWA Rookie of the Year as presented on CWF in Tampa, Florida. He won many awards with Southeastern Championship Wrestling out of Knoxville. And for the purposes of today's recording with Booking the Territory, he is former Smoky Mountain Wrestling commentator, Mr. Les Thatcher. Les, welcome to Booking the Territory Pro Wrestling Podcast, and thank you for your time today, sir.
Well, that's great, Mike. It's a pleasure to be on with you. I've listened to your show a few times. I'm going to tell you the truth. The first time I ever ventured onto Booking the Territory, one of your guys made a comment that, well, Les and Bob, there's no heel. And I thought, okay, that's enough. I'm not into sports entertainment announcing. I don't do that. But, you know, the truth is probably before you guys were born, there was no, I mean, if you had a heel that was a wrestler on to sit in, but, you know, I've worked, I shared the mic with Soli in Atlanta in 73 and 74. I've worked with Caudle, with Lance Russell, with JR, and it was never heel and babyface. It was a play-by-play guy and a color man. One of the nicest compliments I think I ever got was a few years ago, someone had sent a question to JR about how he felt working with me as his color man. He said, I never looked at Les as a color man. I always looked at him as an analyst, and that is exactly what I tried to be. So I never was a character as a wrestler, Mike, so I don't know how to be a character as a commentator either.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, you know, you actually bring up a good point because like I was telling you before we started, you know, watching Mid-South Wrestling as a kid, you know, there was no heel commentator. I mean, you had, you had Bill Watts, and oftentimes, you know, he was with Boyd Pierce, or you had JR and he's with Boyd Pierce. So, I mean, you had different situations where the, you know, commentary wasn't always, how can I say it? You didn't have a heel. I think what me and the guys were talking about was more or less when it was Dutch Mantell, when he first leaves, it's a different dynamic with you and Bob.
Sure.
I always say it's a good dynamic, but it's definitely different because Dutch, as you know, he was so charismatic and good as a quote unquote heel commentator and giving Bob Caudill a hard time because that was part of the interplay of it and what made it really, really entertaining. I think you and Bob are really good together. You'll have good chemistry. It's just different. It's a different take on things. But you do bring up a good point because back in the day you didn't have a heel commentator and a babyface play-by-play guy. It just didn't work that way.
I'm going to tell you the truth. I look at when I first started doing that. Well, first of all, I began, being a commentator in Eastern Canada in 1970, but and then there were no co-hosts, right? You did the whole thing on your own.
Right.
But the first time I ever sat in, I always looked at it like, okay, of course, my wrestling career overlapped my broadcasting career. So for the almost the first 10 years of that, I was both, worked both sides of the street, I guess you could say. But I always looked at it, okay, you listen to a football player, an ex-football player being an analyst, or an ex-basketball player. They don't wet themselves over a little 5-yard flare-out pass, right? They've done that a million times themselves. They've seen that a million times themselves. They get emotional when there's something actually – they take the people with them on that emotional ride. And I quite frankly, and I don't mean to step on anybody's toes because I realize it's a different era, but, when I hear an ex-wrestler having multiple climaxes over a headlock or something, I'm just thinking, what are you selling? It doesn't resonate with me, and I don't think it fits actually with the personality. Well, and of course, today, you and I are going to talk more about Smoky Mountain Wrestling, but in 2019, the crazy thing is virtually everyone's a character, so nobody gets over.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's everybody screaming and yelling, and no one gets over.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's an excellent point. You make a real good point about some of the commentary you hear today, and like you said, you were mentioning to me before we started recording. It would almost in Smoky Mountain Wrestling, you didn't have somebody in your ear the entire time calling everything, telling you what to say, telling you what to do. Those guys, they don't have that luxury. I mean, they've got an earpiece in and they're hearing every single thing. Whereas, like you said, you kind of just reacted to everything organically, and you and JR during your commentaries together, you kind of just went with it and called it as you saw it.
Yeah, it was, and you know what? To me, I think that's, I think JR is the last, I guess, of a dying breed, and I hope that AEW, and I'm assuming that's where he's going to end up, and if he doesn't, they're crazy. That's what separates him from everybody else on the microphones today, is that he can make an average match good, he can make a good match better, but he also tells a story, and he enhances what's going on in the ring. He's not selling you a website or a network or just making crazy assumptions that so many guys are doing. But I realize, it comes down to this, Mike. It's a job, and you do what you're paid to do.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, speaking of the job and being on commentary, we have just reached the point where the Gangstas have come into Smoky Mountain Wrestling. If I can pivot to them, you mentioned
Sure.
in a response to longtime listener of ours, Armando Martinez on Twitter, that the Gangstas are unique, fresh, cutting edge, and ahead of their time. They had so much heat, you were afraid at times they wouldn't get out of the building. If you could, please expand upon that and share your other memories of New Jack and Mustafa in Smoky Mountain Wrestling as the Gangstas.
Well, first of all, I got along with both those guys. I'm a bit of a Bolshevik myself, or a rebel or whatever. But, you realize during that time, you brought these two guys into the southeastern United States.
Right.
And a lot of these in that area are still fighting the war, for Christ's sake, right? And so you got to understand that, especially when New Jack is making O.J. Simpson out to be a hero and that sort of thing. I remember the first time, I forget what town we were in when they first came on board, where we were doing, we used to do a series of four shows, a month's worth of shows at one sitting. And at one point I was out back, and I just overheard one of the deputies, police officers, security guys, I'm not sure exactly what his designation was, but I'm thinking, wow, he's liable to end up shooting one of these guys, opposed to seeing that they get out of town. And I kind of said to him, I said, it's obviously up to you guys to be sure these guys get out of here tonight. And I'm thinking, this is crazy, obviously back then we were still selling the business basically as a shoot, right?
Right.
I mean, at least in Smoky. And and you realize a lot of the fans in that area, I wrestled a lot in that East Tennessee, West Virginia, Kentucky area from 1968 off and on up through, you mentioned Southeastern, and that was 74 through 81. And so I know the people. And I know how passionate they are about wrestling, and I also know about a lot of their political views, which aren't necessarily mine or shouldn't be theirs, actually. But so these guys, they obviously stood out. I don't know if Jimmy ever mentioned this to you or not, and I know you guys have conversations. You've been on his show, and he's been on yours. And by the way, he's one of my favorite people, too. But he had thought at one point to bring Tony Atlas in and have Tammy manage Tony.
Yes, he told us that. The first time we had Jimmy on our show, he mentioned that to us because my co-host Doc said, "Did you ever think about putting Tammy with New Jack?" And he said, "Well, my original plan was to put Tammy with Tony." So we found that to be ironic. But yes, he did mention that to us.
Yeah, so it was heat, and I won't say at some points maybe it was overdone, but realize that New Jack Mustafa, those guys, that was kind of raw talent. It wasn't like these guys were seasoned veterans. It wasn't like you brought in a Sonny King or a Tony Atlas or somebody that, had been in the business for a long time and, realized there were going to be boundaries. So there weren't any boundaries for these guys. And I'm relatively sure that I'm probably right that probably by the time they left the territory, I think there were probably 3 or 4 arrest warrants out for New Jack's hide at some point in time. So to say they got over would, I guess, it'd be a gross understatement in terms of their heels and they're getting heat. But again, they weren't aware where to shut this down. It wasn't like, I can think back to my in-ring career and a lot of the old veteran heels you work with. They knew they'd take us to the edge where they could feel the crowd building. If we go one step further, we're liable to have a riot on our hands, right? And so they knew where to shut it down. But these guys were relatively green, so it was like, we're throwing this against the wall. We're not sure what's going to stick and what's not. But, like I say, I had a good relationship with these guys. And with New Jack, I told him a couple of times, I said, Jerome, you've got to understand that people calling you the N-word, you can't fight everybody that does. You got to take that as you're getting over, right? Because you're a heel, and that's what you're trying to create, that kind of situation. So you can't go out there and throw punches at everybody that, calls you a racial slur. You just can't do that. So it was a learning period for them as well as for us, I guess.
Absolutely. And you mentioned a second ago, you were talking about, he's eliciting a response when he's getting that type of reaction from the crowd, which is his point. You mentioned them, I don't know if you said they went too far, but did you ever think they went too far, as per the example when the night they debuted in, it was Warrensville, North Carolina, when New Jack said he thanked OJ for basically having 2 less people to worry about. Did you think that not just with that, but did you think at any time he almost went too far, or was he just doing his job? Because I feel like he was just doing his job.
Well, I'm sure that, Jimmy a little bit, so there's sometimes I'm not sure he understands the boundaries, right? And when I say that, I love him to death.
Yeah.
I've known Jimmy since he was a fan. I think that they were pushing the envelope, and there were times, I don't know if I just at that particular point looked at it as they've gone, one step over the line, but I might have cringed a little bit myself, realizing at that particular time, that OJ thing was such a sore subject anyway, right?
Yeah.
And so it created, friction on both sides, whether you were for or against, whether you believed he'd done it or he hadn't done it. It created a lot of, heated discussions with people. So, I would say, I'd have to say, especially in that area, if we were talking about urban Atlanta or New York or something, maybe not, because it's a whole different area. But there, yes, I would have to be, honest to say, yeah, I'm sure they took a step or two over the line occasionally.
Yeah, it was. We always say it's. We're actually going to record a couple episodes tonight. It's the 3rd and 4th one that they did, or when they were in. Actually, I'm thinking about it, 3rd and 4th. Technically, it might not be the 3rd and 4th. One of the episodes we're covering is actually Night of Legends, but it's the abbreviated one that you and JR did, where they only aired like 3 matches. The Heavenly Bodies against Storm and Jericho, and then New Jack and Mustafa had their promo, and I think there was a Legends match in there as well. So rock and roll on that one. We're going to review that one tonight. It's just interesting when you hear New Jack cutting those promos. I mean, he really did a good job of getting a reaction from the fans, and Jim Cornette has told us that the heat was good in the big cities. He said the only problem was that the smaller towns, the fans were so upset, a lot of times they wouldn't even come. So I guess that answers our question on too far or not, right?
Yeah. It certainly does. It's funny. I'll give you a quick story. When I had Heartland Wrestling Association here, and I was at one point developmental trainer for WCW, and then again for WWF/WWE. New Jack had a friend or some kind of connection with Dayton, Ohio, which is just 50 miles north of me up I-75. And he called me one time and said, hey, brother, when I'm in town, if you can use me on a show, I'd be more happy to work for you. And I said, I don't think I can afford you. He said, oh, I cut you a good price. I said, no, it's not your payoff. It's bail bonds and getting you out of jail. This is the problem. I think it's going to be the most expensive. So, but like I say, I think Jimmy would probably tell you, Jimmy would actually probably have the figure more, tightly tied down than I would. But I think he had, like I say, at least two or three arrest warrants within that area with his name on them before he left the territory.
Oh my, yeah, something else. So, I will say this: it is good TV. At least we were watching with them in the territory. Hey, you mentioned on Twitter that working with Bob Caudill was special to you. We are obviously huge Bob Caudill fans. God bless him. He's still living. He's just listen to him on commentary. He's just got that voice that you're so familiar with from whether it be Mid-Atlantic or WCW. And now we're getting to the point where his run is about to end in Smoky Mountain. Talk a little bit about working with Bob Caudill, such a special person on commentary.
Well, it's just, it's such a smooth thing to do. And of course, with me as a wrestler, I'd been on shows, when I was working the Tampa territory with Soley, and then obviously when I came into the Carolinas the first few times before I started doing broadcasting myself, I was being on with Bob. But I have been blessed in terms of broadcasting career. I have shared a microphone with Bob Caudill, Lance Russell, Charlie Platt, Ed Capral, Jim Ross, and Gordon Soley. So if that's kind of not the Mount Rushmore of wrestling broadcasting, I'm not sure what the hell would be. And so it's just, well, I had that first show that we did together, and I guess if you were watching all these things, but I had said to Jimmy, we had done some pictures of Bob and I when we were doing Mid-Atlantic simulcast. In Raleigh, we used to double tape. In other words, we were both talking about the same matches, but I had the B show and my desk was over here and Bob's was on the other side, and they were running two tape machines upstairs, right? So they're picking up two different broadcasters, but the same match. And so for the Mid-Atlantic magazine and program, there was some pictures, black and white pictures of Bob and I together. Both of us obviously quite a bit younger. And so that first time that we did the broadcast together, Jimmy opened with that black and white picture and then faded us at the Smoky desk. And so Bob and I have quite a history together, but he's a special guy. I mean, he's just a sweetheart of a guy and so easy to work with. And we did I don't know if they're still out there or not, but a few years ago at the the Charlotte Fan Fest, High Spots had us sit down. They called it they had a series called Old School, and we sat down and talked about our times working together in Mid-Atlantic and in Smoky together. But Bob's a treasure. He really is. And there's a guy that he never, and that's something about most of the old broadcasters that actually were serious. When I first started wrestling, a lot of the TV shows, the host was a local disc jockey or a local TV weatherman or kiddie show host, and so a lot of their commentary was to get themselves over, not so much the matches.
Mm-hmm.
But and the guys that I just mentioned to you that I had the opportunity to work with, that was never the case. Our job and their job, and what I learned from all those people, was our job is to paint a more graphic picture of what you're seeing in the ring and help verbally draw you into what you're watching. And that was, it was never about Bob Caudill. It was always about the product. And I think that's what, helped make him so special, especially back in that era, too, even before Smoky.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that about working with him because it's just ringing in my ear, and I'm visually watching it play back. A couple weeks back, we were doing the first episode that the Gangstas came in on, and I don't mention the Gangstas again, but this is the example I'm thinking when you say that. They walk into the building, and you are painting this picture of, they got their own security because they don't trust the police officers that are in the building, and then Bob Caudill, as to sell it even further, says, it makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable, Les. Just kind of just selling the circumstance and the situation that's going on. So yeah, definitely, it was interesting watching you two work together. And like you said, back in the old, you're right about the old wrestling days. I mean, because like you said, guys would have jobs with the studio or the station, and then they would call it wrestling, I guess, as part of that, right?
Yeah. Well, Bob did as well, but still, he realized that doing the news or a segment on Channel 5 in Raleigh was one thing, but doing wrestling was another. Again, it was I'm Bob Caudill, the newscaster here. I'm Bob Caudill, the the wrestling commentator here, and he also, so everybody said, well, how smart were these guys? And a lot of times. I knew Soley was for a fact because I knew that before I ever, I met Gordon. You mentioned my Rookie of the Year award, which was presented to me in Tampa, and that's where I first met Gordon and first heard him and realized there was somebody that actually called professional wrestling in a serious manner. But that was the thing. Gordon was a broadcaster on wrestling, and of course later on that's what Bob became, as well as Lance. And what Jim was always the case with JR, but that's I especially back then, it probably wouldn't jump off the page at someone in this day and time, but to realize, when as a wrestler, when you've been with these guys who are wanting to make funny remarks or basically come on, like, get me over, and they didn't, you wanted to say, listen, jackass, this is not about you, right? If you bring me on your kiddie show, I'll get you over, right?
Yeah.
But this is not your kiddie show. So to work with people that took what you were doing seriously and sold it seriously, because you realize, again, a lot of people probably listen to you, they don't understand, that the era of kayfabe, as a wrestler, if you were in a bar or a restaurant and somebody got too disparaging with their comments, you'd say, hey, man, there's a big parking lot out here. If you'd like to step outside, I'll be happy to show you what wrestling's about. I mean, that was what we were expected to do. And back in that era, and that's where Smoky kind of bridged that gap, because had somebody have knifed Mustafa or New Jack or even one of the other heels, in that particular part of the country, it wouldn't have been surprising. Realize back when I was a babyface there, a guy by the name of Whitey Caldwell and I worked a huge series when John Kazana had the Knoxville office with the Wright brothers, Ron and Don. Ron had 175 stitches in his back. A fan had zippered him with a knife from his waistline to the base of his neck. I mean, stop and think about that. You're talking about people taking the business seriously, and that's the way we took it, and that's what was expected of these commentators. But again, a lot of the promoters say, hey, and realize we're talking about here too, Mike, the 60s and the 70s. We're not talking about, the inflation. And I mean, back when we're talking about when gasoline was 23 cents a gallon, et cetera, right? So, hey, here's an extra $25. How about sitting in for an hour and doing our wrestling show? Well, yeah, but I got to get my kiddie show over, or my this show, or there's that show over. So when you work with a Bob Caudill or a Lance Russell or a Gordon Soley, you appreciated them because they were showing respect for your business.
Yeah, absolutely. So, no, I enjoyed all those guys. I mean, you're talking about Bob. We're mainly talking about Bob here, but I enjoyed all those guys. You tapped on something just now with Ron Wright. I have heard the story about when he was stabbed and got all those stitches. Talk about, I'm thinking you were only in a few times when Ron Wright was in his main run in Smoky Mountain Wrestling, if I'm thinking correctly. I may be wrong, but it feels like at the time when Ron was in Smoky Mountain.
Oh, yeah.
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 You got any good Ron Wright stories from Smoky Mountain Wrestling? Like I said,
Oh,
I've heard Ron Wright tell the I've heard Ron Fuller, I'm sorry, tell the story about the night Ron Wright got stabbed. But Ron Wright was a tremendous person in Smoky Mountain, and it's a shame we don't have more footage of him from his time that wasn't in Smoky Mountain, because he was something else. That guy was a heck of a God, he was a heck of an on-air It's hard to explain how great he was in Smoky Mountain to somebody who hadn't seen it.
Technically wasn't a great wrestler. He was a brawler more, but his promos
Yes.
sold the whole picture. Well, I mentioned Whitey Caldwell, and I had a hell of a long run with he and his brother. And in fact, we set an attendance, not a dollar and cents record, because obviously with inflation that's changed over time and again. But we set an attendance record at the Knoxville, the Chile Park Amphitheater that's never been broken in terms of audience. And we drew a huge audience in that same amphitheater when it was raining, for Christ's sake, But that's how hot Ron was as a heel. And, it wasn't uncommon. We had a brawl in Morristown, Tennessee, where we got into a four-way, Whitey and I and the Wrights, and Ron said, throw me out and follow me out. So I pitched him and went out behind him, and he'd shot under the ring. And I went under after him, and so we're obviously on our knees, and there was no skirt on the ring. So, all you had to do was lean down. You could see for all four sides what was going on. So he turned around, and we started exchanging shots, and finally he said, I'm going to tape you up. I said, what? And he had a roll of tape in his, athletic tape in his trunks. So he pulls it out, and he starts taping me to the ring support, one of the frame. And so he's obviously facing me, and all of a sudden I see his eyes get big, and I hear him swear under his breath. And I said, what's going on? Because I'm not in a position to find out, but something behind me is happening. So he starts backing out, backing up and getting away from me. And I'm thinking, what the hell's going on here? And then in my peripheral vision, here comes a fan with a knife who was coming to save my life, right? He was going to cut Ron. And the guy, by this time, Ron's out and back up on the apron and into the ring, and the guy turns around and said, I'll get you out, Les. I said, I got it, man. I'm thinking, I don't want you putting that knife near my throat with this damn tape. But that's the kind of heat we had back then, if you've heard the story of Ron Wright, he had a small single-engine Piper Cub.
Right.
And they burned his plane in Harlan, Kentucky.
Yeah, I've heard the story, and I read it. Yeah.
If you're talking about heat, brother, it don't get much more serious than that, I don't think.
He was something else. I tell you, the early days of Smoky Mountain Wrestling too, about the first year for sure, he was something else. I mean, his promos every single week. That's why I say I wish we had more footage of him. Every single week, he would just top himself with the amount of just heat that he would generate with all his ailments, and it just was something else to watch him. He was truly something else, and being able to, in my opinion, like that old adage of talk people into the building. It just seemed like he was really good at that in his role. And then when he finally, turns and gets some sympathy on him, it was just tremendous watching him do his work. And it's always fun to hear Ron Wright stories. I wish he was alive. There's so much I'd want to ask him right now. It's not funny.
Yeah, he was a character. There's no two ways about it. And of course, in terms of the Smoky thing, you give part of that to Corny's creative genius as well. Jimmy. I'll say this today, and I'll say it to anybody that's listening. Jimmy Cornette is still one of the most creative minds in wrestling that's still above ground. I mean, legitimately is. And of course, that was part of the allure of Smoky Mountain anyway, was his creative genius. I mentioned the WFI, Wrestling Fans International Association. They used to have a convention in a different promotion's home city around the country every year. And this was back when fan clubs, and newsletters were a big part of professional wrestling. This was in the 60s to 70s. And so in 1978, they had the convention in Knoxville. It was Southeastern Wrestling. And Jimmy won Best Action Photo by a Fan. That's where I first met him. And we initiated the first sit-down interview type of thing called Personality Profile on Southeastern Wrestling. That was one of my brainchild. So anyway, I had a guy by the name of Jim Ross, who, not RJR, but he was the president of WFI at the time. Jim Melby, it was one of the great historians of the wrestling business, who worked up in Minneapolis with AWA, and Jimmy I had them on Personality Profile. We taped it on a Friday night before the show because at that time we didn't want to smarten anybody up. We didn't want to be in a studio with the boys, right, in case they see a heel talking to a babyface, although maybe they were smart. Hell, I don't know. But that's how I first met Jimmy. And I went to the hotel the one night, and we were talking about different things, and I had ideas, was sharing some ideas I had for the opening of Southeastern, because I had been given, Ron Fuller gave me carte blanche to build me a show. And we had the best damn show in the business at that point in time. I don't mind saying so. And I knew Jimmy, started managing it, and we had lost, we never ran across one another, maybe a hello here or there. So actually when Smoky started, Tim Horner called. Jimmy had Tim Horner call me, and he said, Jimmy wants you to be his lead announcer. I was initially supposed to be the lead announcer, and in part because of our meeting in 1978. And, of course, I had a history as lead announcer through Southeastern, through several incarnations of Southeastern, through Fuller and Barnett, and then Crockett, Mulligan, and Flair. So, but I was also, at the time, I was doing competitive bodybuilding, plus I was training bodybuilders here in Cincinnati. And I told Timmy, I said, right now I'm preparing for a contest. So I would drive you guys crazy because I have to eat every 3 hours, and I have to have certain meals. I can't have, Colonel Sanders or Subway or something like that because, you're dieting down for a competition. So at this point, as much as I'd like to do it, and like I say, I was working with a guy that had a gym here that trained professional bodybuilders and amateurs as well. So that's basically, I'm not saying Bob is second choice by any stretch of the imagination, because I wouldn't consider Bob ever second choice. But that's how Bob ended up being the lead announcer to begin with. So then one day I was at World Gym here, coming out of the shower, and the guy at the front desk said, "You need to call home." Jimmy had my mom's phone number. Your mother needs to talk to you. And so I called. She said, Jimmy Cornette said he needs you, and I forget what town in Kentucky it was in, Mike, but Bob Caudill's ill and can't show up, right? So I rush home, get dressed, get in the car, and run the hell down there. And that's the first time I worked. Well, I'd wrestled Dutch in Southeastern Wrestling. We had Nelson Morel and I had a great tag team program for the Southeastern tag titles with Dutch and old shooter John Foley, the old Englishman. And so I knew Dutch, and that's the first time we worked together. And then when Dutch was headed back to Puerto Rico to be the booker again, that's how it came that, Bob and I started working together.
Yeah, it's funny. I actually was going to ask you that. My co-host Doc wanted me to ask you about how did it come to be so that you actually ended up replacing Dutch. I did not know the story about you prior to when Smoky was starting, that you initially maybe was going to be. Well, I don't want to say maybe it was going to be, but that you got a call from Jimmy to be the lead announcer. I do remember, though, when Bob was not at a set of TV tapings, and I actually I was going to ask Jimmy that question. I was going to ask Cornette that question next time I talked to him, because I was wondering what the circumstances were around that. But it sounds like you're telling me. I'm thinking if it's the taping I'm thinking about, you were there and Bob Caudill wasn't. And it was really weird the way it happened. But that's interesting. So I think I actually think you may have answered a question I had about why Bob Caudill missed about 3 to 4 TVs at one point. And then later on, once Dutch is gone, you end up obviously taking Dutch's place when he went to Puerto Rico. So I was curious how all that happened, but interesting story right there you just gave.
Yep, that's how it all worked. And then, of course, Bob, my God, he put in a lifetime of wrestling and so forth. And it was just that he was getting tired of making the trips, And so, and of course, Then and Dutch came in and did a few sets with me, but JR had left WWE or WWF at the time. And so, here's another funny story. You mentioned the Night of Legends, which to me, the lead into the little segments Jimmy and I did as a lead in, I think is some of the best work I've ever done. I enjoyed it, I guess.
Can I stop you for 1 second and tell you about those? Because those
Yes.
are really enjoyable, and here's why I say that. I'm not from that area, so while I knew a little bit about some of the stuff you talked about leading up to the Night of Legends, because I think it was like maybe 6, 7, 8 weeks straight where those segments ran. That is some really good stuff to watch. You kind of walk through the history, and it wasn't just recent history. I mean, you guys went really far back in some instances, but I thought that was really, really cool to do leading up to that big show.
Well, when I mentioned the amphitheater at Chilhowee Park, I introduced a couple segments from there, from out front of the park and from inside the park. I mean, inside the amphitheater as well. It was empty at the time, but that was so much fun to do. But so, a funny story, the Night of Legends is the first time JR and I had ever sat down at a desk together. And, I'd met Jim, and hello, how are you? I mean, we weren't bosom buddies. We had never worked together, never worked for the same company, as a matter of fact. So anyway, midway through the show at the Legends, they took a break. The camera guys had to reload, put more film in or whatever. And we went to the back to get a drink, use the bathroom. So as I was coming through, Terry Funk said, "Hey, man, I've been watching this on the monitor." He said, "That's the way a wrestling match should be called, the way you and JR are doing." He said, "How long have you and Jim worked together?" And I looked at my watch. I said, "About an hour and a half." He said, "Oh, bullshit." I said, "No, that's how long we've worked together." But that's how easy it was. And I've said, I guess I'm patting myself on the back. Well, but when you take professionals, it's like a match in the ring. You may have never worked with this guy, but once you figure out each other's rhythm, it just falls into place, And that's what I said. These guys this is probably their Mount Rushmore of announcers, wrestling announcers, that I've been blessed to work with. There's never been, wow, this is tough, or this is hard. I don't know how to work with this guy, or this guy's, It's always been such an honor and a pleasure to work with these guys. But one of the nicest compliments, never actually was given to me face on, but Jimmy had sent out a newsletter or something to all the talent, the wrestling talent in Smoky about making announcements. We need to change this, do this, or do that. And one of them showed it to me, and this is when JR and I started working together there. And he said, "We now have the best announce team in the business." And I don't know that I could ask for a better compliment than that. And again, part of that is when you're working with great people, then they make you better.
Yeah, I tell you what. I really like you and JR on the Thrill Seekers and Heavenly Bodies match. I thought y'all, it was just really, really good. And I guess I realized that was you and him your first time together. But I mean, it's not like you're going to announce that, but it's interesting that was, you guys had only been doing it at that point for an hour and a half. And it was really good. It was some tremendous stuff. That was a great call though with those two teams. I really enjoyed that match. And oh my God, Jericho looked like he just was slaughtered. The amount of blood was I've seen a lot of wrestling matches, Les, and that was a lot of blood. I mean, he really was bleeding. He was gushing.
If Jimmy could have found a baseball bat to beat him over the head with when he found out he broke his arm, it would have been more blood than you saw in the match. I remember that. We were doing promos in the back, right? And somebody came in and said, "They've just rushed Jericho to the hospital," and Jimmy just, what? Yes, he was trying this in the ring, and he broke. I said, "Oh, Jimmy. Well, you've heard Jimmy go ballistic before, so I don't need to even try to imitate Jimmy." And I thought, oh my God, of all the times, But you realize that the amount of talent that we had on that show. And, realized that Smoky was syndicated, or was on, what was it, the satellite, the USA satellite or something, All-American satellite or something at that particular time, Smoky and ECW. And I think Jared's promotion out of Memphis were all on this satellite thing. In fact, there was a small low power station here in Cincinnati that picked all those shows up off the satellite as well. But it was.
There was
there
was a ton of talent on that card, though. Like, to the point you were making.
We had fans from California in for that show. They had the meet and greet thing, the VIP deal before the show, and so we're circulating with the fans for that and taking pictures with them and this and that and the other thing. So there was this husband and wife and a friend of theirs who came up and introduced themselves, and we talked. And they were from, I forget where in Southern California, but they're in Southern. I said, so you came in for fan weekend? No, we've got a flight out tomorrow. They flew in for the show and caught a flight out of Knoxville back to California the next morning because they had to be to work first of the week. But that's how hot that show was, where it could be seen. I mean, and if you stop to think about in terms of the, you might call it a low budget, production in comparison to what WWF was at the time or WCW or anything else. And yet, the stories were that compelling and the people got emotionally involved enough to come from all around the damn country for that Night of Legends.
Yeah, I've heard Jim tell the story about when Jericho broke his arm. And the thing was about that, like everybody needs to realize, they had spent X amount of hours on TV building up this match between the Heavenly Bodies and the Thrill Seekers, and Chris Jericho broke his arm. I thought he gutted it out, though. He came out there, he had the brace on, and he worked the match, and he got through it, and my God, he was bloody. But it was a heck of a night. It really was. Not just the matches, but they honored so many great people like Ron Wright and everyone who got honored that was there. Just tremendous stuff. And again, I guess I realized it, but I don't know if I realized it, that you and JR were, that was your first time on commentary together. So, not to toot your horn, but I'm gonna do it. That was a heck of a night of calling the action by you two, for sure.
It was just a great night, and I think all the way across the board. Well, Phil Rainey, when you watch the Hall of Fame presentations, the guy that helped me with the Hall of Fame,
yeah,
he was my first broadcast partner on Southeastern when we went to WBR, when we went to CBS affiliate in 1975. Phil was my co-host, and he actually worked. He was a sportsman on another station on the ABC affiliate, But now here was a guy who never tried to get himself over. One of the cool things about working with Phil on the Southeastern shows were, as a fan, he would interject things, but he would ask me legitimate questions, which gave me an opportunity to embellish what we were watching, because he would ask, well, why is this guy doing this, or why isn't he going back to that? And Phil's passed away. I don't know how many years ago it's been, but really nice guy. And so he was the guy helping with the awards. And if you remember, I mentioned Whitey Caldwell. Nancy, his wife, accepted for Whitey that night. Whitey had been killed in a car wreck with some drunk driver that hit him head on, and. But yeah, that was I guess say that's, to me, one of the favorite shows that I've ever been a part of. Well, we're talking about the Thrill Seekers. I remember Jimmy telling me these two young guys are coming in, they're this and that, and as much as the Gangstas got over with the heat, and you might say they were a little ahead of their time. But Lance and Chris didn't get over as strong as they should. Well, of course, they were, it was their first run in the States, and they were still, in the process of improving their in-ring product as well as promos and stuff. And they didn't, the fans in that area weren't as much into the aerial stuff. And so, in actuality, they were ahead of their time when they came in there.
Yeah, I've said for when they come in, it's so, wrestling was so much different. When I grew up, because like I said, I grew up on Mid-South, and the reason I'm bringing this up is I remember, when you had the territories and they were alive, I can remember guys coming in, very young, their first few matches, and they weren't judged immediately by, oh, they're going to make it just on this one thing. And the example I'll give is, I do a show with Brian Lass on the Mid-South Television Review Show, and we were just reviewing an episode a few weeks back where Dr. Death makes his debut. And when you see Dr. Death when he first starts, it's a total different person than you see him, just 3 to 4 years later. The reason I say that is, and I've heard Jimmy say this about Chris Jericho and Lance Storm, like you see some of their early, I guess, work in the ring and how they look. They weren't bad at all. You could tell they were young though. And then, but you also look at their promos. Chris Jericho's promos got exponentially better over the years. I mean, he's just tremendous. But you watch him in early Smoky Mountain, not say early, but in '94 when he comes in, he looks totally different. But it's just nice. Back in the territories, you would see, to me, I feel like guys would have more time to grow. And you saw that with Jericho and Lance Storm. The area, like you said, they maybe weren't into the whole aerial thing. And it's funny you bring that up because I can remember you and Bob Caudill on commentary, even, just calling the moves was different. It sounded like for you guys, you can tell me that. But if I'm right or wrong, but that was even different
right.
too. So it was like they would do these innovative moves, and you're right. Sometimes the crowd wasn't sure how to react or wasn't sure what was what, but they were definitely innovative. I mean, they were something else. And I mean, it's easy now to look at them and go, oh, you could see they were going to make it. But, who knew back then? But they grew so much, and they weren't bad. It's just that you can see how much they grew from that time in '94 to, I mean, look at Chris Jericho. He's still doing it to this day.
Yeah, and Lance was a hell of a performer too. Technically extremely good, and I've had the opportunity to work. We've become very close, and I've had the chance to work with him in training seminars, and he's a very talented trainer as well. So, so they both have progressed in their own way in different avenues, but still both of them continue to grow and improve on what they were doing.
Yeah, it was really good. Hey, let me ask you this before I forget. Tommy Noe and I have connected via social media, and he's been on the show multiple times, like I'd mentioned to you. He mentioned an interview you did with the Headbangers to me where they took off your glasses and messed up your hair. He mentioned this to you, so I haven't seen this yet, or if I've seen it, I don't remember. Do you recall this, and what was your reaction to it?
Yeah, I don't remember. I don't remember if they took my glasses off or not, but yeah. Okay. Well, here's to embellish that funny story. Was Brian Hildebrand, Mark Curtis, had a cat named after. He had a cat named Thatcher. And I said, why the hell did you name? I said, nobody's ever named a cat after me. Why'd you name the cat Thatcher? He said, because like you, he's never got a hair out of place. Right. And of course, if I'm going on camera, I'm not necessarily a vain person, but I'm selling myself as part of the product here, right? So I wanted to dress properly, and when I was much younger, before Smoky, I mean, I was quite a clothes horse in my 30s and 40s, but so I always wanted to make sure my hair was combed and everything. And somebody had put the bangers onto that, like mess his hair up, and I didn't sell it. I didn't register it, but when I got to the back and they said, "I know you're hot," it was a quick thing. I don't know if you'll catch it on camera or not. To be honest with you, I don't know for sure, but they're good guys too. We introduced a lot. Well, we talked about the Gangstas, the Headbangers. The Thrill Seekers. We introduced a lot of. How about a guy by the name of Glenn Jacobs?
Glenn Jacobs, right? Yeah.
Yeah, he was. He came in. Well, originally came in with Eddie Gilbert to be Eddie's partner, and then Eddie decided to go to take off in the middle of the night and go to Puerto Rico. God rest his soul, which is where he passed away. So then Glenn ended up being partners with Al. Well, Al Snow wasn't a new guy. But Al had never been in a position to do TV with any regularity or do promos. Al's, originally a Ohio boy too, up north of me in Lima. So he, when he'd drive down here and we'd go to make the TVs. That's all we were doing together a lot. But that also gave Al more exposure and actually got him his first contract with WWF. So there was a lot of that, the talent that got exposed there on Smoky that may otherwise have still been, hiding somewhere in the, behind the scenes if it weren't for that.
Yeah, it's tremendous when you look at. I mean, even was it Balls Mahoney as oh God, I'm dropping his name. Boo Bradley,
Yeah, Boo Bradley, right? Yeah, and now you want to talk about something that never mind cringing at that Dujak talking about OJ when they made like they had thrown Boo's cat in a tree shredder, right? I thought, Jesus, Jimmy, are you out of your friggin' mind? Right? Every animal, group in the world is going to be picketing the damn matches before this is all over. I don't know if you've gotten to that point or past that point. I'm not even sure.
Yeah.
At some point, Tammy. That's the way Tammy and Chris. Talking about great talent being exposed, Chris Candido, for God's sakes. And Tammy got getting her start there. But yeah, they threw Boo's cat into the shredder. And I thought, oh my God! And I'm a pet lover. I've had dogs and cats all my life, and I thought, man, you want to talk about crossing the line? You're out of your friggin' mind.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, imagine if someone did that today. Oh my God, PETA would be in an uproar, even though it was just for TV. But I agree. You were about to start talking about Tammy and Chris. Oh my God. Chris to me he felt like a star even from the time he got there, even though he was still learning. And Tammy, I mean, I've heard the story from Jimmy. She's on TV that first time, and literally, I mean, it's the first time she'd ever done TV, and it's just unreal how quick she grows into that role and being able to cut those promos. So tremendous stuff, again, once from Smoky Mountain Wrestling. And again, two people that basically, Tammy definitely got her start there, but Tammy and Chris, got their start very, very young in Smoky Mountain Wrestling, just like a bunch of other people.
Yeah, Chris and I hit it off well because he was a big weight room freak like myself, and so we got a chance to train together some, and we'd talk, go have lunch and talk nutrition and different ways to lift and work out and so forth. So yeah, sadly enough, there's a guy that went way before his time, and just an amazing talent.
Yeah, he was good. You weren't on commentary at the time, but the feud he had with Tim Horner in '93, I believe it was. Those two, I really liked their little feud. It ended up with like a baby bonnet match. It was really good stuff, and it was fun to watch. But they and that was when Chris first got there. But he was so good, and like you said, just gone way too soon. He just a raw deal that took him. It's really sad what happened to him.
Yeah, it's just a shame. I mean, that territory couldn't survive. And looking back at it, when I first went in and started doing the shows, I'll tell you the first Coliseum show I ever did. I don't remember what the hell. Well, it was early on because they were getting. It was Garvin. I forget who all was, but it was the finals for the Smoky Mountain Heavyweight Championship.
Yeah, that was the Volunteer Slam '92, right?
Knoxville Civic Coliseum.
Yeah. Yep.
And I remember driving in and come in the night before. And so anyway, I'm one of these people that if I'm on time, I figure I'm late. So I always try to get every place early. And I had never, worked Smoky at the time or done the promos or anything. So I pull in the bottom of the Coliseum. Of course, that's where we wrestled at Southeastern, so I was very familiar with the building. So as I'm walking in, Horner and I forget if somebody was with him. They were coming out toward the underground parking, and they said, "Boy, Cornette's going to be happy to see you." And I said, "Well," he said, "You better hurry." I said, "I'm not expected. Why am I hurrying? Because there's nothing to do." But I forget who the kid was that had been doing the ring announcing. It wasn't Tommy. I forget the guy's name. Nice guy. But he was trying to do the promos, interview the guys and intro the promos, and Jimmy was pulling his hair out, and I just, I walked in the door and Jimmy said, "Les, grab his microphone. I said, what? Here, you got to do this, right? And I'd never done a Smoky Mountain promo in my friggin' life, right? So you start now, right? And that was my introduction to doing Smoky Mountain promos on that particular day. But you know what? I had so much fun with that. JR said, it was just, and work with Jimmy was a lot of fun. So much, especially in realizing, I'd seen him as a fan in 1978 and watched how he had grown. And, and we were, I mean, he would, like I say, he'd tell you what he needed, but he didn't come out and tell you how to, he didn't put words in your mouth. He realized that, he hired us because we could create, on our own. And I think that's what's missing in the business today, Mike, honestly, isn't, giving a guy, I mean, there are guys who need to be told every step of the way, but, so much is so cut and dried, so micromanaged that it's just, it leaves, the people don't get emotionally involved. And they did. You want a good story about the great mind of Jimmy Cornette where he slips up once in a while?
Sure, please.
Have you? Sure, if you can pull anything over Jimmy, right? Yes. Have you seen Bluegrass Brawl where Lance Russell and I did the commentary?
Yes, I have.
Okay. All right. What? How many guys are in that main event? What? 10 guys or 8? I forget. Right? It was.
Yeah, it was the 3 teams technically, so it would be 9, right?
Yeah. 3. Yeah. Okay. So anyway. As I mentioned, Jimmy would say, I need this out of this match, I need this out of that match. And on this particular situation in Pikeville, we didn't have headsets, right? There were no headsets. So it was just Lance and I with our microphones. And so we're into the main event. And, of course, and the other bad part, we didn't have monitors, right? So we didn't know what the cameras were shooting. And these guys are over here doing this. 2 other guys are here, 2 other guys. And like, what the hell, should we be calling? We weren't sure either.
Right.
So as this match is building, Lance is scribbling something on a piece of paper, and he shoves it over to me. And he said, who's going over? And I scribbled on a piece of paper, pushed it back. I don't know. Didn't Jimmy tell you? He writes, no. So we had no idea what we should be calling toward the finish. We didn't even know what the hell the finish was, right? He had neglected to tell us, and in the course of us getting ready, neither one of us had asked. So what we had to do after the whole thing was over, after the building was empty, we got in front of a monitor. They set up a monitor. And we, like the last couple minutes of that thing, we dubbed the voice over so we could actually, put our concentrate on the finish because Jimmy had forgot to tell us what the damn finish of that. And when it's that many people, it's not like we're going to throw something in here and hope we get it right.
Right.
That was the whole thing.
Yeah, I had no idea. Wow, that's a good story. That's a good one. How are you on time? Because I did have a couple listener questions they had sent me to.
I'm good.
Okay.
Whatever you need.
Sure. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Time is a valuable thing, and you've given me a lot, so thank you.
At my age, Mike, the clock is ticking. Yeah, go ahead.
No problem. Thank you so much. Actually, one question from my co-host who couldn't make it first, and then I'll get into the listener ones. He and I were talking about Smoky Mountain Wrestling. It closed down in '95. Given, the wrestling boom period that I call it that took place with the Monday Night Wars in '96, do you think if Jimmy could have held on for another year that Smoky Mountain may have survived and been profitable and enough to continue not only beyond '96 but well into the 2000s and possibly now, just given, the type of ship he ran?
I would have hoped so. Probably at some point. I doubt that we'd be in business today, due to the climate of the business and how it's changed. But I think one of the things there, and of course you realize hindsight is always 20/20. But I remember that, initially when we were doing, we would go to a different town to do our block of 4 TV shows. And at one point they were bringing a big production van out of Atlanta, right? And so the cost, I wasn't privy to the books, but I know what's, the amount of money that something like that's going to take. Plus, the time that as we change a Jim in Harlan or a Jim in this city of North Carolina or over here or over there, your production crews had to come in and find the best way to set up lighting. They had the best way to set this up and that up. That wasn't always the best angles. Lighting might be not as up to par as you'd want it, but it's all you could. I often wondered, had Jimmy have found an old warehouse or something on the outskirts of Knoxville, would it have been cheaper to have put a long-term lease on like an old warehouse and set up the place for that, where all we had to go in and throw a switch, the lights came, and everything was going to be there. You could have even run a couple small, small shows in there other than the TV, because I know that, back in the territory days, that was, a case. And so I remember in Phoenix, Arizona, they used to do their TV. They had an old grocery store, the promoters out there, which was their offices, but it was also where they did the TV, but they also ran just a regular show in there besides the TV. So my curiosity is, would that have saved more money, which would have stretched out the run of Smoky Mountain? Am I making sense, I hope?
Yeah, it is. It's making a lot of sense, because you would have had one place where you weren't paying, this huge production truck, every once a month to go to a town and set up and all the costs that incurred with that, versus, having one location where you can, like you said, flip the switch. It's a lot more controlled, and it's probably nowhere near as costly, even though we don't know what the books look like, but it definitely makes sense. And if that would have helped and been able to, help get past, Thanksgiving of 95 when things, when things shut down. I always just wonder what it would have been like if he could have survived, because I mean, literally, if you're shutting down in Thanksgiving of 95, and if you think about it, with the way the Monday Night Wars took place, I mean, all of a sudden, by spring, I'll just say spring to summer of 96, not even 6 months later, the wrestling world, at least for fans that I knew, and again, I'm a fan, it just was on fire with those two companies going at it face to face, and you had the NWO. So it just makes me wonder if wrestling was in that down period when he started Smoky Mountain Wrestling, and if you could survive that and get into 96, it just makes me. I always want to believe, at least in my mind, that they could have weathered that storm, and like you said, they may not be in business now, but at least would have went into the 2000s and beyond, which would have been kind of cool.
Yeah. Well, how much longer did Jarrett's Memphis promotion run?
Not that much longer. I mean, a few more years, but you're right.
But part of it, I think, too, was they had studio wrestling, right? So they didn't have to incur those production costs unless they were taking a couple cameras out someplace to shoot an angle, or progress a storyline in one of their towns. So yeah, that's just something. Again, like I say, hindsight is always 20/20.
Yeah.
And but I've often wondered about that. If that would have given the company more longevity.
Yeah, it would have been something to see if he could have held on. I did have another question from one of the listeners, Armando. Have you seen this recently released video of the Knoxville 5 exposing the business? Have you seen this video or heard about it at all?
Oh, I probably have heard about it, but exactly who are we talking about?
Well, it's a video of this was during the Knoxville quote unquote wrestling war, and there was
I was there in the middle of that. Yes, so
okay.
But I don't know that I ever saw this video.
It just came out on social media about a week and a half ago as of us recording this, and it is Ron Garvin, Bob Roop, Ron Wright, Bob Orton Jr., and Boris Malenko, and they are talking about Plan B as it relates to the Knoxville wrestling war. And from what I've been told, this video was shot overnight at one of the studios, and it's basically these guys exposing what we would term exposing the wrestling business on video as it pertains to the war. So I can.
Well, you know what? I don't think I ever saw it. I don't know that they ran. They were on Channel 26, And like I say, I was there in the midst of that. Didn't the whole thing? I won't. We could kill another hour about that, but I will tell you, that I've been at conventions with Bob and with Bobby, with Roop and Orton Jr. and Garvin will tell you, it was a dumb move, and it was.
Yeah.
I was involved in the Atlanta War. Through Ann Gunkel's promotion versus the NWA. That's when Gordon and I did the television together, and I was part of the office there. But all the stupidity in Knoxville did was kill the business in Knoxville, period, because the town wasn't big enough to take that, right? And when they pulled out, we knew they were going before they went, because somebody had cued Ron's dad in. But, he had to sit on it because we had all these guys figured into angles. But we knew they were pulling out, quite a few weeks before they did. But then if they'd have spent more time actually maybe promoting their product opposed to challenging people who they knew weren't going to accept the challenges. And when I say that, it's over and done with. And like I say, I socialize with Roop and Garvin at reunions and stuff, and what's done's done. But yeah, it was a bad time, and it was a stupid mistake. And one of the things is they say, and I will wrap it up with this. Well, Ron Fuller was taking money off the top in the houses, and my answer now, I did not handle money. I was part of the Knoxville office from the get-go. I was the initial. There was Ron, Mac McMurray, and myself. Were basically the three people that consisted of the office. Well, Ron's wife as well. But my answer to that, having worked in so many territories, if Ron Fuller as a promoter wasn't taking something off the top, he was the only damn promoter in the business that wasn't. Right. So it was just a dumb reason to split. Right, because the old, when I grew up in the business, I started in 19. The old saying was, whoever's got the first count on the tickets is the guy's going to make the most money. Right? Like I say, I never handled the money there, so I couldn't tell you if he took 1%, 6%, or 9,000%. I don't know.
Yeah.
But if he wasn't taking a little bit off the top, he would be the only promoter I figured I ever worked with or for that wasn't. So of all the silly reasons to start a war, that was the dumbest. And like I say, all it did. Well, I was there through. He sold to Barnett, and I stayed with Barnett for a while. Then I went down to Mobile, where I got a chance to work with my buddy Charlie Platt on the Dothan television for Southeastern. But then when Crockett and Mulligan and Flair bought the territory, Rick called me and said, "Hey, Channel 10 says they'll keep us on TV." But part of the deal is they want you back, because I was like the mediator between Southeastern and Channel 10, and I had a good working relationship with the programming director and the sales manager and so forth and so on. So that's one of the reasons I packed my bags and went back to Knoxville. But that was actually the last studio wrestling was when when Flair and Mulligan and Crockett had it. That last serious studio wrestling in that city, and all the war did was kill the damn territory, quite frankly.
Yep, it's the wrestling business sometimes, right?
Yep.
Here's another one for you, Keith, on our Facebook page. He wanted to know, you worked a little with Dutch Mantell on commentary, not much, but given how great Dutch was, do you wish, given circumstances, being better in Smoky Mountain, that you could have worked with Dutch a lot more? Now, I know you worked with Dutch wrestling as well, but I'm guessing there was only a few occasions where you got to work with Dutch on commentary, right?
Well, you know what? Steve Dunn of Well Done,
yes,
right?
Yep. Yep.
And his partners, they had a promotion. This would have been, God, let me stop and think here, probably 98 or 99 in Nashville. They started a promotion, and the old fairgrounds there at Nashville Fairgrounds that they're tearing down, where NWA just ran their 70th anniversary or whatever the hell it was a while back. I was doing TV there for them, and Dutch was my color man there. So that was the other opportunity I had. Oh, I enjoyed working with Dutch. I mean, we had a good relationship anyway. As wrestlers in ring, but the broadcast, he was easy to work with and easy to bounce stuff off of. And so, yeah, I enjoyed working with him. And he's got a damn good fertile mind for the business as well. And which is, was part of, he was a booker for both the Puerto Rican promotions. And actually, it seemed like when he was one, they were on top of the game. When he went to the other one, they pulled up. So, yeah, but he was fun to work with, easy to work with, and it was easy for us to feed off of one another. So, I would love to work with him again at some point. At this point in my life, I don't know, how. I mean, Lance Russell. When let me throw this in real quick. When Gordon Soley retired, I was a little radio talk show station across the river here in northern Kentucky that we were doing a radio show. This is one in the early stages of when I had HWA here. And when Gordon retired, we put together a tribute show. And we had Lou Thez on, and we had Corny on, we had Debbie Combs on, we had Don Curtis, and we had Lance on as well. And I was listening to, I got cassettes. For those who don't know, that's a little tape that you put in a machine. And I was listening to it a while back, and that was when did Gordon retire? Was that 90 what? 96, 97, 90? I don't know. Anyway, when Lance was on with Gordon and I, and we were talking about having fun telling the story. And Lance said then, the problem now, the guys don't tell a story. And I thought, my God, if he didn't think they were telling a story then, they damn sure ain't telling one now.
You're right.
So,
yeah.
So it's so, and to me that was always the fun thing, is to embellish what they were doing by adding depth to what they were doing, and especially, like I said, JR called me an analyst, in fact saying, well, this guy's, watch him build his offense now. It's a spot. Somebody grabs a hold and works it. Do you watch NXT at all?
I do. I don't watch it every single week, but I catch all of the specials.
Please go watch Matt Riddle and Drew Gulak.
Oh, okay. I'll definitely do so. I will say this.
Amazing wrestling match. Of course, both these guys, I've had the opportunity to work with both of them in training sessions, and Drew worked a promotion I booked for a year in L.A. a few years back, too. But they just have a hell of a wrestling match. And so, yeah, it would be hard for Gordon, any of us to I'm amazed how well JR has made the transition, but I think in part that reason is that he never dropped away from the business. He made the transition as the transition was made, as it stopped being working holes and the storyline being the most important thing to being more like a video game. And as great as it was to work with all these guys that I mentioned earlier, I don't know that we could all sit down unless the guys in the ring had the kind of match that Gulak and Matt Riddle were having. Or I find, to me, honestly, and I know this got nothing to do with Smoky or anything else, but right now NXT, to me, is the closest thing to what I used to do as anything there is in the business.
Like I said, I don't get to watch the. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, in terms of stories and everything, I think so. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But yeah, it would, as much as I'd enjoy doing something with any of these guys. But Dutch has such a, he's sort of Jimmy Cornette with a beard in terms of quick wit, right? I mean, and that's like working with Jimmy. I'd say, your guys are wrestling this guy and just hold the damn microphone, right? You didn't have to do any talking at all. Just let Jimmy do it. But yeah, Dutch was a pleasure to work with. He's a pro.
He's tremendous. He's great on commentary. He's just like you said, his mind is so good for it. And Jimmy has told me when we had him on, he talked about how he bounced a lot of ideas off of Dutch in Smoky Mountain in that early going. Well, the whole time Dutch was there because Dutch was so good, and it was somebody that he could have that could be a sounding board and say, Dutch, think about this. What about this? And like you said, Dutch's mind is just so good. It's just he's just he to me. I say this all the time, and I go, he's one of the best commentators. He's like underrated as a commentator because I don't think anybody ever talks about him as a commentator, but he's so good with Bob Caudill and Smoky Mountain. You have to mention him when you're talking about, guys that do commentary. But the thing was, not a lot of people were exposed to Smoky Mountain Wrestling, so they don't even think about it. But in my mind, I go, man, him and Bob as a team were just tremendous. So I think that's where that question came from, wondering about you and Dutch, and if y'all had a chance to work together. It would have been great because Dutch would have been just like he was with Bob, where he always made these jokes and he would insult Bob and Bob would be so appalled. They just really had a nice little interplay between themselves, and I could see you guys being the exact same way, which would be funny.
Well, when we worked together in Nashville, the sad thing was I guess their promotion was a little underfinanced or whatever the case may be. But, I forget how many shows we did there. But it was, and they had some decent talent in and stuff too. And some guys who became big stars were just, James Storm, for example, was just getting his feet wet, in the business. And, but they had, they had some good guys there. But yeah, that was the only other time I had the opportunity to work with Dutch. But yeah, it was always a pleasure.
I could see that. Hi, Lucas had a question from our Facebook page. He says, do you think a lot of your students from HWA would have fit in Smoky Mountain Wrestling? And these are the guys he named just as an example: John Moxley, B.J. Whitmer, Matt Stryker, Nigel McGuinness. I guess he's asking, what do you think about those guys fitting in with what was done in Smoky Mountain Wrestling?
Yes, they would, and the reason they would, because the first thing I teach is basics. And that's one thing, Mike. I've been in this. July the 4th of this year will be the 59th anniversary of my first match. I started in this business when I was 19 years old. And the one thing that's never going to change in this business is the foundation and the fundamentals. You can call it sports entertainment. You can call it monopoly. You can call it any damn thing you want. And you can change the way. But the foundation is still the foundation. And if you actually want to tell a story, and then you've got to be able, to have that foundation. And that's one of the things that I taught all these guys. And the other thing is, you came out of my school, you know how to call a match on the fly. What you do now, you're paid. Again, I said earlier, it's a business, so you do what you're paid to do. But that's one of the things. HWA, it was. Here's the finish. You build the match, and because guys, human beings make mistakes, and let's say you and I are having a match, and we've got this elaborate finish where you're going to the top rope and do some craziness to beat me, and we're going 20 minutes, and say 7, 8, 9, 10 minutes in, you pull a hamstring. Not bad enough that we got to stop the match, but bad enough you can't make that move to the top rope to get this elaborate finish in. Well, if all we know is what we talked about in the back, we're in trouble, man.
Yeah.
Because if we can't readjust it and call it on the fly, what are we going to do? Ask for timeout so we can go back and talk about it again?
Right. No, that's a good point. I do. I don't know how today's athletes do the hold choreograph, spot for spot. It's like you said, being able to call it in a ring, call it on a fly is something that now it's becoming, it's not a complete lost art, but it's definitely becoming one. But, at least you taught that. And then the guys we're talking about here. Yeah.
That's the actual art of being a worker. And I'm using my fingers in quotations now. There are a lot of performers and entertainers in our business today, but there's very few workers.
Yeah.
Jericho is a worker.
Oh, yeah.
But I can say the guys you mentioned, BJ, Nigel, Stryker, they're workers. They were workers. And to me, that's the foundation. And again, if somebody's paying you high six figures or seven figures to lay everything. I don't know how if I were a young guy today with the same background that I have, and you said, hey, we're laying out a 15-minute match or I'm going to shoot you, I'd say, Mike, shoot me, because I don't know how the hell to do that. Well, part of that is, too, you have to adjust for a crowd. The crowd in Knoxville tonight, you and I may have this match that we've, paint by numbers, laid out move by move, and the people are excited with it. We take that same match to another town tomorrow night, and they may sit on their hands. What the hell are we going to do?
Right, they're dead. You're just going to go through all that, and they're dead. They're sitting on their hands, yeah.
Sure. So we need to be able to, and that's, like I say, that's really the art of the business, is being able to adjust to what the audience is or is not buying. And that's start. You're right. It's not a lost art, but it's sadly enough going in that direction.
Yeah, it's like one of those things that it's through the test of time. Through time, because there's so little people still doing it. Not literally, but the amount of people still doing it. It's just becoming something that's a loss. I thought it was interesting, thinking about B.J. Whitmer. Well, in your school, how much do you talk about like just doing commentary and things too? Because I'm gonna, again, congratulate you on something. I used to, watching ROH, I used to believe that like Nigel and BJ, like even within the last year before he left ROH, I used to think BJ Whitmer was tremendous on commentary. He wouldn't do it all the time, but I always thought he was real good on commentary. He definitely was.
You mentioned Nigel and BJ are two of the. I'm proud of a lot of I call them my kids. And right. Obviously they're way past the age of being kids, but they're mine. I couldn't tell you how proud I am of both those guys. BJ now is signed on as senior producer for AEW, and part is because those guys had the opportunity to work with him in Ring of Honor as a producer. And but yeah, he was. I've had the opportunity to work with him as a trainer in recent years. I mentioned Los Angeles, and I booked a year-long tournament out there where I used a lot of these guys: Gargano, Gulak, Adam Cole, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And Nigel also was my booker on this thing as well. And I'm so proud of those guys and to have been a small part of their growth and development in this business. And yeah, they're tremendous guys. But yeah, there are some, Adam Pearce, who works behind the scenes for WWE now, he worked that tournament with me out there. But there was a guy who would transcend. He was the NWA champion for a while. He would have fit in 1968 or 1978 as well as in 2008 or 2018. He could shift. The guys who, if you've only got the one dimension, if all you can do is call it, move for move, you're in trouble. You're limited in what you can do. And that's, and so, it's like if you're a quarterback and you've got two plays and that's all you got, you're not going to win a hell of a lot of games. You've got to be able to adjust. That's
a good analogy. If you're a quarterback and all you got is 2-3 plays in your playbook, you'll be in trouble if you keep trying to run the same ones over and over. So yeah, definitely. One more question, Les, and then then we'll wrap things up. This was from one of our listeners as well on Facebook, Mark. He said, I think hopefully I'm phrasing this right. He says, have you ever considered creating a YouTube channel with something like your personality profile that you used to do back in the day? And he says, with the benefit of 2019 hindsight. I guess he's meaning like taking all your knowledge over the years and having a YouTube channel and sharing those your knowledge there is what I'm thinking.
Is there any money to be made there, Mike? I don't know.
Yeah, YouTube. There used to be. I mean, there is potential, but it's you're right. It's becoming it's a cluttered market. The whole YouTube channel. We have a small one. I won't tell you that a lot of money is made off of it, but we have a small one. It's growing, and we'll see what happens. But yeah.
You realize that I was one of the first wrestlers to have a weekly podcast.
I don't know if I realized that.
Doc, huh?
I don't know if I realized that.
Yeah, Doc Young, who's passed away now, passed away a couple years ago. He initially, this would have been back, gosh, I don't know, 2005 maybe or so. He was producer for a guy's podcast that had me on as a guest, and Doc, this guy got bigger than he should have, or his head got bigger than it should have, or whatever. And Doc had contacted me and said, would you try something with me? And I said, what? And he said, would you co-host a podcast with me? And we got listen, I don't follow all this stuff as closely as I used to, but we got a couple awards from some website that, as best, wrestling podcast of the year or something back in 2006 and 7. But I was doing these things, and then he got an illness in it, which he ended up dying from. But he was producing behind the scenes for the Observer Figure 4 Weekly website, where I do a weekly show now. But initially, when I came on there, is when he wanted to get back in it. He called me, and so I started doing it with him until his health wouldn't allow it anymore. And so I currently do it with Vic Sosa. But so yeah, I was doing podcasts, and I haven't gotten rich yet.
Neither have I.
People say you've done everything in the wrestling business. And I said everything but get rich, and at this point, I think I'm giving up on that. So it's.
I hear you. No, I hear you very much. Yeah, that makes two of us. I haven't gotten well. I hold down a regular 9 to 5 and have done so for a long time. This is more of a hobby, but it's a lot of fun. I get to talk to guys like you, Jim Cornette, Tracy Smothers, and talk about things that they love. And
how often do you talk to my friend Jimmy?
Not often, but I talk to his co-hosts weekly. Brian and I talk.
Brian.
Yeah, Brian and I talk all the time.
You tell Brian I'm watching these Crockett Cup videos, and 90% of the magazine pages they're throwing up there I've either designed or laid out, or from when I edited for magazines for Crockett. So tell him I'm going to send him a damn bill.
I will. I'm actually going to be talking to him in the morning. We got to record another episode of our Mid-South show. So I talk to Brian often.
Show a while back, a couple of years ago, I guess it was.
I remember when he had you on. Yeah, the 605. Yeah, I remember when he had you on. But I talk to him more often than I talk to Jim Cornette. When I talk to Cornette, it's a lot of times through email. I'll email him from time to time or on Twitter. And he's been on, like I said, he's been on a few times. But I definitely talk to Brian a lot more than I do Jimmy. So we have a lot of fun. We do that Mid-South. Just like I do the Smoky Mountain show with my guys, Brian and I do the Mid-South show with just he and I, and it's a lot of fun.
I've got to be honest with you here, and this will expose me as an idiot old man, but my cell phone got run over by a car, believe it or not. It wasn't on my person when it got run over by the car, thank God.
You're right.
But Jimmy's phone number is in there, and I haven't had the opportunity to get his phone number from anybody. So, but I call and tell him myself, listen, Corny, I'm going to send you a friggin' bill for you're using my magazines to plug the NWA stuff. I want a payday, for Christ's sake.
I'll make sure I mention it to Brian tomorrow. Oh, man. So, but it was really great talking to you. I really appreciate you taking some time with me, sitting down and talking some Smoky Mountain Wrestling, along with many other things. It's definitely been a blast.
My pleasure.
And thank you so much. And who knows, we should maybe do this again sometime. And I appreciate, let me tell you this too, I appreciate the shares on Facebook and the retweet on Twitter, telling people, hey, this was a fun time, because that's one thing about Smoky Mountain Wrestling. More than anything, it just seems like a fun time. I wasn't there to see it live. I wasn't there when it was happening live, nor was I able to watch it while it was happening. But I can tell you this much, 20 plus years later, watching it, it's a blast. And, Bob Caudill used to always say at the beginning of every episode, wrestling the way it used to be and the way you like it. And I can say that for the most part, that's what Smoky Mountain was during its run.
I can too. I agree. And Mike, it's been fun. I hope it's been entertaining and informing for anybody who's listening to it. And if I bored you to death, I'm sorry.
No, sir, you haven't bored me. But do you want to tell if anyone wants to stay in touch with you, whether it be Twitter or various other places on social media?
Yeah,
you want to tell them where to find you?
I do weekend training camps, and or one-day seminars for that matter. And you can reach me les@epwt.com or lesthatcher@zoomtown.com. And I'd be more than happy to send you the information on those training camps. I will say this: I can pretty much guarantee that if you spend a weekend with me, I'll give you if you're a young wrestler, I'll give you tools to up your game and improve your in-ring performance.
There you go. So make sure you contact Les if you're interested. And again, I want to thank you, and I'll ask you to hang tight as soon as I stop this recording. That way I can chat with you offline for a second. But thanks again, sir, and it's been a pleasure and honor. I really have enjoyed talking to you about Smoky Mountain Wrestling.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much, Mike.
No problem.